My name is Remy Foster, and the day my aunt laughed at my scar, the whole table joined her. She called it ugly, said I should cover it before people lost their appetite. I didn't say a word. I just stared at the smoke rising from the grill, trying not to shake. But then her husband, Colonel Briggs, looked at me. His face froze. He pushed back his chair, stood up, and raised his hand in a perfect military salute. The laughter stopped, and in that breathless silence, every wound I'd hidden for years came roaring back, because the man she married was saluting the scar she had just mocked. I went back to Oregon for my grandfather's birthday, telling myself it was just a dinner, nothing more. I'd missed enough family gatherings over the years, and I wanted peace, not another round of explanations about my life. The yard was packed with cousins and chatter, the smell of grilled meat and laughter thick in the air. I kept my sleeves rolled up that afternoon. Maybe I wanted to see if time had softened them. It hadn't. Aunt Marlene spotted me first, her lipstick the color of polished wine, and her tone sweet as venom. She leaned toward the table, smiling at the others. "People are trying to eat," she said, nodding toward my arm. "Maybe cover that thing up before dessert." The word thing hit harder than I expected. Laughter rippled down the table, polite, nervous, but still laughter. I felt my face burn. For a second, I almost apologized for existing. Then the chair beside her scraped back. Colonel Briggs, her husband, rose slowly. The light shifted when he stepped forward, his eyes fixed on my arm. "That scar. Kandahar, right? You saved Sergeant Reeve." His voice wasn't loud, but it sliced through the noise. He straightened his spine and saluted me across the table. The laughter died instantly. Even the wind seemed to stop moving. Marlene's wineglass trembled, a thin ring of red spilling onto her perfect white dress. No one spoke. I sat frozen, fork still in hand. The sound of that single salute echoing in my chest. In that moment, the air around me changed. Respect had entered the room, but it came wrapped in isolation. When I finally stood to leave, every step felt heavier, as if I were walking out of one battlefield and straight into another. The morning after the barbecue, I drove back to the old house that used to belong to my father. The porch creaked the same way it had when I was a kid, but everything else looked smaller, like the place had shrunk around its own silence. Aunt Marlene followed me in, still talking, still trying to turn every word into a reminder of how much I owed her. She pointed at the picture frames on the mantel, all polished to a mirror shine, none of them holding my face. She said I should feel lucky she'd taken me in after my mother died. I didn't argue. I'd stopped doing that years ago. I'd learned that her love came with a leash and a smile. When she left the room, I started packing what little was left of my father's things: books, an old watch, a box of envelopes yellowed at the edges. One of them had my name written in his handwriting. The seal was unbroken. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a letter dated the week I left for basic training. His words were short, steady, and unlike anything I'd ever been told in that house. "You were born to serve, not to please." The breath caught in my chest. All those years of thinking he disapproved of me, all the guilt I carried for leaving. It had never been his voice. It had been hers. Marlene must have hidden the letter, thinking she was saving me from disappointment. Instead, she had stolen the only truth that could have set me free. Standing there in that spotless, suffocating room, I realized her love had never been about care. It had been about control. And for the first time, I wondered what else she'd kept from me. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still smell the smoke. Kandahar never leaves you. It waits behind every quiet moment, ready to return. The day the blast hit, I was kneeling beside a truck, hands slick with blood and dust. I remember the sound before the fire, the sharp metallic snap that meant everything was about to end. The explosion threw me backward, but I crawled toward the shouting. There were too many bodies. Too little time. I had to choose. Sergeant Reeve was pinned under a collapsed door, eyes wide but calm. I worked until my gloves tore, until the world narrowed to the rhythm of his breathing and the pounding in my ears. He bled out before the medevac arrived, just before the line on the monitor went flat. He whispered, "Tell my commander I wasn't afraid." Those words became the echo that lived inside my skull for years. Back home, I wore long sleeves no matter the season. People said I was modest. The truth was, I couldn't bear to see the proof of that day burned into my skin. Every interview request, every award nomination, I turned them down. I didn't deserve praise for surviving when he hadn't. It wasn't until years later, at that barbecue, that I learned who his commander had been. Colonel Henry Briggs, the same man who stood and saluted me while everyone else laughed. The same man whose eyes carried the weight of a memory only soldiers could understand. That night, I went to the mirror and rolled up my sleeve. The scar caught the light, raw and uneven. For the first time, I didn't see a flaw. I saw a record of every heartbeat that kept going when it shouldn't have. The mark of a man's final words and a medic's promise to never forget. The gossip started before I even got back to my car that day. By the next morning, I'd already been turned into the headline of every family phone call, Remy and her desperate need for attention. Aunt Marlene was relentless. She called me that afternoon, her voice sharp and cold beneath its practiced charm. "You embarrassed me. Remy, my husband made a spectacle out of you." I almost laughed at the irony, but instead I hung up and sat staring at the scar on my arm. For years, it had been a secret between me and the silence. Now, it had become dinner table entertainment. 2 days later, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Marlene. Colonel Briggs asked if we could meet for coffee near the base. I hesitated, part of me afraid of what he might say, part of me oddly drawn to the steady calm in his voice. When I walked into the cafe, he was already there, uniform pressed, hands folded neatly over a small velvet box. He pushed it toward me, and inside lay a metal pin glinting under the dim light. 11th MEU. The same insignia worn by Sergeant Reeve. My throat tightened. He told me he'd read the after-action report from Kandahar. He knew my name, my unit, every decision I made that night. Then his voice grew softer, almost like confession. Reeve was my son, he said, fostered when he was 12. I never told Marlene. Some memories aren't built for dinner conversations. The coffee between us went cold, black, and bitter. When I couldn't find words, he added, "You gave my son peace. You earned that scar more than any medal." The sentence hung between us, quiet and heavy. Earned. It was the first time anyone had ever tied that word to my scar. When I left the cafe, the sky over San Antonio was pale and restless. I walked with the pin in my hand, feeling its weight press into my skin. Respect, I realized, didn't come from rank or family. It came from being seen by someone who understood the cost. Still, I knew the calm wouldn't last. Marlene never lost a battle without planning her next attack. I tried to focus on my work, teaching new medics about field triage, but peace didn't last a week. An email from a producer landed in my inbox, the subject line screaming, "The woman who hides her war scar." Attached was a photo of me in uniform, one only Marlene could have had. She had sent it to the local network, pitching my story as a family redemption piece. Her version, of course, made me the reckless niece who shamed her relatives and ran from her past. Not long after, my commanding officer called me in. He said the words I'd been dreading. "Public Relations wants a full report on Kandahar. They're worried about optics." I nodded, numb, hearing the subtext. My story had become a problem again. That night, when I returned to my apartment, a small package waited by the door. No return address. Inside was a sand-stained envelope, the paper brittle and yellowed. My name wasn't on it, but I knew who it belonged to the moment I saw the handwriting. The letter had been written by Reeve. The words were shaky, scattered with dried dust. He wrote about his unit, about wanting to go home, about fear and faith and noise. The last line stopped me cold. "Tell the medic her hands were steady." My knees gave out. I sat on the floor and read it again until the ink blurred. When I called Briggs, My voice barely worked. He was quiet for a long time before he said, "I kept that letter. It came through the veteran network after the war. I couldn't open it. Not until now." I could hear him exhale, the weight of 15 years in that sound. I stayed up the rest of the night, staring at the letter spread across the kitchen table. The grains of sand clung to my fingertips, rough and real, like proof the past couldn't be polished away. The world could twist headlines, spin pity into scandal. But this letter was untouchable. By dawn, I'd stopped shaking. I stood before the mirror, rolled up my sleeve, and looked straight at the scar. If they wanted a story, they'd get the truth. I picked up my phone and called Sophie. "I'm coming on your show," I said. But this time, I'm telling it myself. The studio lights felt hotter than the desert. I sat beneath them, palms damp, the scar on my arm catching the glow like a brand. The show was called Women Behind the Uniform. Sophie was hosting. Marlene had arranged everything, promising it would set the record straight. I should have known her version of straight always curved toward control. As the countdown ended, Sophie began reading from the teleprompter. Remy Foster, a medic injured during training. The words hit like shrapnel. The lie rolled off her tongue as the camera zoomed in, closing on my hand. Online comments popped up on the monitor, snickering emojis, strangers dissecting my skin. I heard my own breathing louder than the studio hum. Briggs's words echoed in my head. "If you stay silent, they'll tell your story for you." I leaned forward, cutting through the cue cards. That wasn't a training accident. It was a convoy hit by an IED. 4 lived because 1 didn't. The set froze. Sophie's hands trembled. I went on. His name was Sergeant Reeve. He died in my arms, and I carry that day with me, not as shame, but as proof he mattered. The silence that followed was absolute. When I stepped out, my phone was buzzing nonstop. The clip was already trending. "Steady hands, Remy." Messages poured in from veterans, medics, even Reeve's widow. She gave him peace. "We owe her our respect." Briggs texted me one line. "You stood your ground." I didn't answer, but I smiled. Somewhere, Marlene was watching the broadcast, her empire of pretense beginning to crumble. By the next morning, the storm had hit full force. Marlene called first, furious, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You both humiliated me on national TV." Then Briggs answered her in the only way that mattered, by walking out. He packed a single bag and left the house before dawn. Sophie came to see me later that week. She looked smaller somehow, stripped of her studio glow. "Mom's breaking," she said. But maybe that's what she needed. I nodded, unsure whether to feel pity or relief. That night, a package arrived from Briggs. Inside was the original letter Reeve had written before he died, the one Briggs had kept hidden in his safe. The final line was the same. "Tell the medic her hands were steady." I traced the words with my thumb until the ink smudged. Hours later, another envelope slipped under my door. Briggs's handwriting again. He admitted he'd known for years who I was. He just couldn't bear to tell Marlene, because she'd never forgive the idea that honor didn't wear lipstick. Sophie found her mother reading that same letter days later. The house was spotless as always, but the air hung heavy. On the table sat a single rose from the barbecue, now dry and colorless. Marlene's voice cracked when she finally spoke. "I destroyed everything just to feel superior." Sophie didn't record it. She just held her mother's hand. And for the first time, silence in that family felt like something close to truth. Part 5. The climax. The invitation came handwritten. No phone calls, no explanations, just a time, a place, and Henry Briggs's familiar initials. I knew before walking in that this dinner wasn't about celebration. It was about reckoning. The table was small, the light dim, and the air too quiet to feel safe. Marlene arrived first, armored in pearls and pride, her posture straight, but her hands trembling. Sophie followed, restless, trying to fill the silence with polite words that went nowhere. Briggs set a single envelope in the center of the table. Read it, he said softly. Out loud. Sophie opened it and began reading Reeves' letter, her voice unsteady. Tell my commander I wasn't afraid, and tell the medic her hands were steady. The words cut through the stillness like prayer. Marlene looked down, eyes glistening, her confidence collapsing one breath at a time. Briggs confessed he had known all along, that he'd read the report, recognized the name, and stayed silent to protect his wife from the truth she couldn't live with. Marlene's tears finally came. I thought protecting you meant keeping you small, she whispered. I met her eyes. You can't protect someone by erasing them. Sophie lifted her phone to record, but Briggs stopped her gently. Some truths don't need broadcasting. They just need to be said once. No one apologized. No one had to. In that fragile quiet, every wall that had separated us began to crumble. And for the first time, no one looked away from me. The hall in Salem shimmered under warm lights, flags lining the stage like sentinels. Cameras crowded the aisles, reporters whispering about the woman with the scar. I could hear the buzz of their anticipation. They wanted a tearful confession, something made for prime time. But this wasn't a performance. This was the only story I had left to tell on my own terms. I spotted Marlene sitting in the back row, her posture rigid, eyes lowered. Colonel Briggs sat near the front, his uniform crisp, his hands trembling slightly on his cane. The moment my name was called, the microphone cracked, then died. The silence that followed could have swallowed me whole. I set my notes aside and spoke without them. Scars aren't flaws, I said. They're records of courage. Applause rose before I could continue, rolling through the hall like a wave. I told them about Reeve, how he'd died in my arms, how his last words stayed carved into me. Tell my commander I wasn't afraid. And when I looked up, Henry Briggs was already on his feet, saluting. One by one, the room followed him, hundreds of people standing together in quiet respect. After the ceremony, Marlene approached. Her hand shook as she touched my arm. You carried it alone long enough, she said. Let us carry it now. For the first time, she spoke in plural, we. Henry's eyes glistened when I turned to him. You made him proud, and me too. He whispered, and in that moment, the scar no longer belonged to shame, it belonged to peace. A year later, the sky over Portland looked like brushed steel, bright, but quiet. The cemetery was lined with flags and folding chairs, the kind of solemn symmetry Henry Briggs would have appreciated. He had died in his sleep 3 weeks earlier, his heart finally giving in. The funeral was full of uniforms and salutes, the low hum of a bugle carrying over the grass. I stood at the front, the medal he once gave me pinned above my heart, my hands steady. Marlene arrived late, her face drawn but composed. She walked up to me after the ceremony, something small clutched in her hand. When she opened her palm, the sunlight caught the silver edge of the 11th MEU insignia. He said you carried both of them, she whispered. She pressed the badge into my hand and walked away before I could speak. For the first time, she didn't fill the silence. She respected it. When they asked me to give the eulogy, I didn't read from notes. I looked at the sea of faces and said, respect doesn't always start in the family, but sometimes it ends there. When they finally learned to see you, no one moved at first. Then one soldier stood and saluted, and another followed, and then the entire crowd rose to their feet. It was the same gesture that once shattered a barbecue table. But now it wasn't shock. It was unity. After the service, Sophie walked beside me, camera hanging at her side. She'd become an independent journalist, quieter, sharper. Later that night, she sent me a short clip, me walking away from the grave, wind tugging at my sleeve, the caption reading, "The scar that changed how we see courage." Back home, I opened the window. The evening light poured in, soft and gold. For the first time in years, I didn't cover my arm. I let the sun touch the scar, felt its warmth instead of its sting. For years, I hid it so no one would ask. Now, I let the light find it because it's not a wound anymore. It's where the light enters me. It was never about revenge. It was about clarity. 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 It was about clarity.